we saw that this pyramid gave the American public a clue as to what they should be eating to have a healthy diet. And if you'll remember, the first chunk of the pyramid here was grains, and then we had veggies, and then we had fruits, and then we had yellow, and I asked you what was the yellow. Haven't heard from anybody yet. And then the blue is dairy products, and I'm just going to write milk in here. And the purple is proteins, for example, meat and beans. Okay, so we'll say proteins. We get proteins largely from the meat and beans. Okay, I'll tell you, the yellow, I did some digging and I figured it out. It's actually oils, which is what we guessed. Okay, oils. So the width of these wedges is supposed to give you a clue as to how much of each of these types of foods you should be eating in your balanced diet. But the actual serving amounts you need to figure out from your nutritional self-study, which hopefully you did. But anyway, the reason why I bring this up again is because right now we're talking about the, what is the difference between good carbs and bad carbs. And if you look at the food pyramid, it doesn't say carbs anywhere. We mentioned protein here as a type of food. Oil, of course, is within the lipid and the fats food group, but where does it say the carbs food group? It doesn't. It says grains, veggies, fruits, and then these others. Well, as it turns out, grains, veggies, and fruits are good sources of carbohydrates. Okay, so carbs, we'll find our carbs in these foods, grains, veggies, and fruits. All right, and as it turns out, according to the food guide pyramid, 55% of calories should come from carbohydrates. So this looks like a big chunk of the pyramid, and so 55% of the calories should come from carbohydrates. Of course, these foods contain more than just carbohydrates. The carbohydrate, remember, is the macronutrient. These foods, grains, vegetables, and fruits, are also great sources of micronutrients. And we'll talk about that when we talk about vitamins and minerals. So it's not just the carbs that you're getting when you eat these foods, but it's the other nutrients that are packaged with those carbs. Okay, so according to the food guide pyramid, like I said, 55% of your calories should come from carbohydrates. So that's the maximum of your diet, all the way up to 65%. But some carbs are labeled bad and some are good, so we need to figure out what's the difference. If 55% of our calories can come from carbohydrates, can we eat all bad carbs? So we need to figure out what's the difference between good and bad carbs. As it turns out, bad carbs will be what we consider simple carbohydrates, and good carbs are what we consider complex carbohydrates. Okay, so I don't know why I wrote that like that. Okay, so simple carbohydrates versus complex carbohydrates is the difference between good and bad. All right, so what is a carbohydrate? Carbohydrate is the word from which we get the word carbs, obviously, for short, carbs. Carbs are carbohydrates, and carbohydrates by definition, right here's the definition of carbohydrates, are mainly sugars and starches, together constituting one of the three principal types of nutrients used as energy sources or calories by your body. So that's the macronutrient food group called carbohydrates. Carbohydrates can also be defined chemically as neutral compounds of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so from a chemist's point of view, a carbohydrate is a molecule that contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And further, the carbon to hydrogen to oxygen ratio is on a number ratio of 1 carbon atom to 2 hydrogen atoms to 1 oxygen atom. That's the ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen in carbohydrates. And so that's where the word comes from, carbo, from carbon, and then hydrate is for water, because the hydrogen and oxygen is in the same ratio as the hydrogen and oxygens are in water. Water is in a ratio of 2 hydrogens for every 1 oxygen. So early on, when chemists were first discovering the components of this particular macronutrient and doing some simple chemical analysis, they realized that in a sample of carbohydrates, the carbon to hydrogen to oxygen ratio always came out as 1 to 2 to 1. And of course, back then, they didn't know the details of what's bound to what, the details of chemical structure. All they knew is what elements were in certain chemicals. So that's why they called it hydrate. It's not really carbon, excuse me, surrounded by water molecules, as oftentimes the word hydrate is used to indicate that literally water molecules are packed together, for example, in minerals or with other molecules that may absorb water, that sort of a thing, or ionic salts that absorb water. We also oftentimes say they're hydrates, but in this case, it's not the case. It's just that it's coincidentally the ratio of hydrogen to oxygen is 2 to 1. And we'll look chemically at how they're actually, what they actually look like here on the next slide. But anyway, some examples of foods that contain simple carbohydrates are table sugar, honey, and fruit. Fruits contain a lot of simple carbohydrates. Examples of complex carbohydrates or foods that contain complex carbohydrates are whole grains and vegetables. Okay, so if you want to avoid the bad carbs, you want to avoid these sources of carbohydrates, and if you want to get the good carbs, then you have to eat these types of foods, whole grains and vegetables.